You have to tell me if I'm talking.
I am so thrilled to have on the podcast today Francesca Matasu, who is an alumni of the Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, Massachusetts, a parent now of a child who attends Sudbury Valley, and a part-time staff member at Sudbury Valley. And of course, if you're a frequent listener to this podcast, you know that I love to feature schools that are modeled after Sudbury Valley, as well as people involved with Sudbury Valley School, including one of the co-founders, Mimsy Sadovsky, who I had on the podcast about a year ago, and some other recent alumni and parents of students at Sudbury Valley. My children attend Sudbury Valley. It was founded in 1968 as a fully self-directed, non-coercive democratic school, and since then has inspired the growth of dozens of Sudbury model schools around the world that really, again, value kind of childhood independence, freedom, autonomy, personal responsibility. So it's wonderful to have Francesca here to share her experience, not only as a student who attended Sudbury Valley School from the time she was 4 years old to just almost 19 when she graduated in 2007, and then ended up sending her child, and she has a younger one who'll be attending sometime soon as well, and now working at Sudbury Valley. So Francesca Matasu, welcome to the
Thank you so
Liberated
much for having me,
podcast.
Carrie.
So
It's great
glad
to
you're
be here.
here. Yeah, so glad you're here. So let's start back at the beginning. Your father began working at Sudbury Valley School in the fall of 1988, so about 20 years into Sudbury Valley's existence. And it became clear, I imagine, for him early on that you would be attending there at some point. I think you said that you were an infant when he started working there, and then you enrolled as soon as you could at 4, and your sibling did as well. So, tell us a little bit about that experience, if you would, of, maybe conversations that you had with him, subsequent, why he was attracted to Sudbury Valley School and why he thought it would be a great place for you and, again, your brother.
So my dad had first heard about Sudbury Valley while he was in college. They were in some sort of education class, I guess. Now this is very secondhand information, so I don't know how 100% accurate it is, but they were in a class about education, and he and another friend of his had learned about the Sudbury Valley School at the time. And then graduated from there. He had sort of moved around a little bit. He was living in Brooklyn, New York, which is where I was born. That's where my mom is from, with my brother, my mom. And he was a public school teacher in Brooklyn at the time, and was really kind of unhappy. He would go in and sort of feel like this is not how we should be educating kids. This is not the right way to do this. And actually, the friend of his who he had done the paper with was a staff member at Sudbury Valley at the time. I think that he might have been like an interim staff, but they were really low on staff then. And he called up my dad and was basically like, "Hey, you should. I'm leaving, and this position is going to be open. What would you think about being a staff at Sudbury Valley?" And my father has always been really driven by his own moral compass, and has always been really good about listening to his own sort of inner dialogue and following through with that. So he knew that it was right for him, and so he had to convince my mom to move from Brooklyn, where all her family was. My mom went to Catholic school all the way through, from all the way up. So it was definitely like I want to work here, and I want to send our kids to this sort of very, very unique, at the time, incredibly unheard of, this school. And so he convinced her, and they moved up here. And I don't remember ever we talked about other types of schooling at certain points in my life when I was sort of kind of lost and looking for something else. We would talk about what other schooling could look like, but this was just what we knew.
Oh, great. So what are your earliest memories, Francesca, from joining Sudbury Valley at age 4? And Sudbury Valley welcomes learners mixed age from 4 years old up until about 19, all kind of free play, mixed age. There's no kind of grades or class segmentation. And what was that like for you in those early days of joining the school?
But it's funny because it's really one of the things I think I've always really loved so much about this place, and I think partially because of growing up here and experiencing it firsthand, is the community. It's the community of students, and it's how it's sort of like a village or a family, like what you would think about from years and years ago. And what I remember from being really little was the older kids, and I was here long days because my dad was working here at the time, so I it was a lot. And for a 4-year-old, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. is a long day here. And so there would be teenage girls that I would go and sit with them, and they would read to me, or we would do stuff together, or they would kind of check in on me. And I loved it. I just felt such a part of it. It's so, I think that when you're really little, it's almost easier because you never second guess your place. You know that this is your place, you know where you are. The world is your oyster, literally. Like this is it's your place. And then the older you get, I think sometimes then you can sort of be like, well, I don't want to annoy anybody, or I don't want to bother anybody, or I don't want to just like insert myself. But yeah, I think that's sort of what I remember most from being really little, was just the care from the other kids.
So great. Yeah, and I love that you are recording this podcast from Sudbury Valley School. So we hear that joyful play in the background.
Which there's some little ones out there right now.
Yeah, it's so great. And I do love to sort of the flexibility with the Sudbury model, not only in terms of its self-directed approach. There are no adult imposed classes, no curriculum, no tests, no grades. But there's also flexibility in terms of the schedule during the week. So it's a recognized private school, but it's opened from 8:30 to 5 o'clock. And again, to comply with compulsory school attendance laws, students have to attend a minimum of 5 hours each day, but can kind of pick those 5 hours. And of course, as you mentioned, your dad was working there when you were little, so you kind of had to stay the full day. But I'll say that my kids never want to leave. They like to get there as early as possible and stay as long as possible during the day. So I think it's a testament to the success of the school and the fact that kids really want to be there. So as you got older and really experienced your full childhood and adolescence at Sudbury Valley, how did you learn, right? I think that's sort of the biggest question that onlookers to the Sudbury model or self-directed education more broadly ask is, how do young people learn when they're not being forced?
Well, it's an interesting question, because how does a child learn to walk? How does an infant learn to crawl? Their body starts to move. They inherently want to do that thing. And so I think the thing is especially, after having kids and sort of watching them, we're aware as human beings, we are aware of our surroundings from the time we open our eyes. And the surroundings can get bigger and smaller depending on like what you're sort of looking at for. But how you learn because you're interested. You learn because you want to. You learn because you don't know how already. So, how do you learn to play the piano? First, you think, I want to play the piano. And then you go about, making sound with the keys and what sounds right and what sounds good. And sometimes, you say, hey, I would really like some input. I would really like some help. I'd really like some guidance on this. And, one of the things I'll probably say a lot of times, one of the things I love about this place, which there are obviously many from having spent my whole life here and now sending my kids here, it's the tools to figure it out for yourself. It's no one is going to sit there and say, this is how you do it, but they'll say, okay, you want to learn this thing? Here, read this book. Or, hey, you want to learn this thing? Well, this is how you do it. Practice doing this and let me know how that goes for you. And then it's sort of on you, on your terms, how much effort you put into it, how long you pursue it for, and, whether that becomes a lifelong passion or just, another sort of forgotten hobby. It's kind of up to you. But I think when it comes to learning like a traditional curriculum, I learned a lot of math because I really liked using the kitchen. So we would do a lot of cooking. We would do a lot of bake sales. We would do a lot of fundraisers. And when you're trying to purchase ingredients, for instance, for a school full of people, when you're trying to make the most money from your fundraiser, you're doing math. You're constantly doing that kind of math. You're altering recipes. I was really also interested in sewing. So I would make clothing, and I would have to alter patterns to fit my measurements. So that was, another math thing there. I also really love to talk a lot. So, English, your vocabulary, those kinds of things, you're listening to people, you're talking all the time. You're going to come across words you don't mean, or not words you don't mean, excuse me, but words you don't know. And then you say, oh, hey, what was that? What did that word mean? And either somebody will explain it to you or you look it up in the dictionary, and then there you go. It's right there. Um, as far as that kind of stuff, I think it's a natural occurrence of living life, and especially living life with people of different ages. And that's the other thing I think is that, like, in a traditional school where you're in a classroom where you are really segregated with people your own age, whether you are more advanced or less advanced than sort of your class, there's not a lot of room to go in either direction. Where here, you have somebody who comes in. I mean, my husband also went to Sudbury Valley. He's an alumni as well. And he came in when I think he was 12. And the first thing he did for like the first year he was here, he played outside with other kids. Like, he just wanted to play. He was so excited to be outside, to be making believe, and all of the sort of like rough and tumble aspects of outdoor play that he had missed out on his previous experiences. Which I think for a lot of people, you'd say like, oh, a 12-year-old playing outside, like, okay, but you get so much from that, and from the ability to decide in which direction you're going. Sort of, it's not linear. It can be anything.
So many good points there. Yeah, there's so much imaginative free play. I know my kids are outside all the time. And it's just such a gift, I think, especially as today's childhood becomes more enclosed, more structured, more supervised, to be able to allow children to have that freedom, especially that freedom outside. And then your point about learning from others and that mixed age, I do think that's one of Sudbury's special sauces, is that, like you mentioned, the piano, right? Like, you could learn piano from someone who's even a child, who's
Oh, definitely.
older or potentially younger than you,
Yeah,
because
sure.
they are talented musicians. And the same thing with art or chess or any of the other activities that young people engage in at Sudbury Valley, and so many more. So as you went along through your experience at Sudbury Valley, kind of into your teen years, what were some of your reflections or observations then, as you kind of hit adolescence and had been there for so long? You mentioned, talking about other kinds of schooling. Were there other sort of inflection points for you as you began to reflect on your experience learning in this way?
It's really interesting because I remember, like, I can almost break up my experience at Sudbury Valley into phases, almost like of life, essentially, where you're sort of new and exciting and all that stuff. When I was probably, I would say, like 11 to 13, those were the years that I was the most unsure of myself, and thus unsure of my surroundings, basically, for lack of a better word. As things happen here, we had some of my really good friends were leaving. They were moving on. Especially, I was really good friends with a lot of boys my own age, and they really wanted to play sports. And that's one thing that we don't offer here because it's just not big enough for team sports. And so I was sort of kind of floating around a little bit, and I had talked about like what public school might be like, and we had sort of discussed that. Not I mean, really, honestly, it was probably never like a serious discussion because I knew that I was never going to want to sit through, being probably mostly being told what to do has never been my favorite thing. So I think probably that would be my biggest hindrance in that environment. But that was sort of where I was the most lost, I guess, during my whole time here. And then sort of what happened to me as I got older was for me, I started to recognize the difference between taking from the community and giving to the community. As far as holding offices was concerned, running for a JC clerk, being involved in the judicial committee, spending more time in school meeting, more involved with committees and corporations, and like I said, fundraising, those kinds of things. When I think I was 17 or 18, some girlfriends of mine and I decided, at that time we had what was called the ECLF, the Emergency Tuition Loan Fund. And it was a fund in place for people who were not able to pay their tuition, for current families who were going through a hardship and were not able to do that. And we decided to put on an auction. We were like, let's get people to donate stuff and we'll do a silent auction. And we raised like $5,000, I think, for that. When it was just sort of like, hey, let's see what this is like. Let's do this. And, we reached out to businesses, to the student, the community. At that time, we had an assembly. So that was sort of, I think, probably easier to kind of get a mass email or inquiry out to them. And people were so generous, so supportive, so kind through the whole thing. It made it really easy. I thought about it afterwards as an adult, being like, well, we just decided to do this thing. Like, hey, let's ask people to donate this thing and put on this auction. And, going through the whole process of requesting a night to be at Sudbury Valley from school meeting, and like the whole process of sort of what that looked like to just get this one event off the ground, which was so natural to us. It was so just what we knew you had to do, that it's amazing how that translates to parts of your life as you graduated and moved on and moved forward in your life. The ability to say like, oh, great, we're going to do this thing. Okay, what needs to happen for this thing? Oh, we got to do all of these. These are all preliminary before we can do this. We have to do this. It's like anything. It's like, that recipe or that instruction manual when you go to put a piece of furniture together. Like, you got to get your tools out first. So I think that was something that, like, that transition for me between what I could take from the community and then what I could give back to the community was really a special and important thing for me, for my time here.
So great. And I think it's also really reflective, Francesca, of childhood and adolescent development more generally, right? That in sort of younger to middle childhood, there's, lots of play and imagination. And then that kind of middle school age is when you're just starting to figure out where you fit and what is this world that you're in, and you're questioning. And I think that seems to be what you experienced as well. And then you kind of hit your teenage years and figure out, okay, now I'm here, and what's my purpose and what's my contribution, and take on more of that leadership role. And you're able to do that so much more organically, so much more naturally at a place like Sudbury Valley that gives you the freedom and autonomy to do that. I think it's also great that you brought up the emergency tuition fund and fundraising for that. Sudbury Valley is, of course, a low-cost private school. It's about a third or even a quarter the cost of other secular private schools in Massachusetts, and half the cost of per pupil expenditure in the public schools in Framingham, which is where Sudbury Valley is located. So already financially accessible for more families, given its lower price tag, but still, when families run into some hardships, nice that you had that community option for them. So you had built up this leadership capacity kind of over your time at Sudbury Valley. What happened after you graduated? Did you feel like you were prepared for the quote unquote real world?
I did. The year I graduated in June, the following year I kind of was just still working at a retail job that I liked at the Natick Mall. And then I moved in with my boyfriend in that spring. So I was 19. We moved in together, and he's my husband now. We've been together since we were here 20 years. So it worked out. Long term, it worked out. But it was interesting because I think for me, I almost had too many options. I had a lot of hobbies. I had a lot of passions. I had a lot of places I was sort of being pulled. And I was kind of trying to figure out which road I wanted to take, which direction I went in. I ended up going to hair school. And so I'm a cosmetologist as well. Working in salons has always been, a really interesting dynamic, I would say. I love the work. I didn't always love the backroom dynamic of working in that industry. But yeah, no, I felt like I had no pressure to do any one thing. And so almost that's where the real self-directed part of the education comes in, where you say, like, you got to sit yourself down and say, like, what do you want to do? How do you want to do this? Move forward. Let's make that go. And so I think for me, it was a lot of sort of like, I'm going to do this thing. And I would do something for a while. And I'd be like, I really don't like this part of it, or there's an aspect of this I really don't care for. What do I like about it? What do I not like about it? And so for me, it was always, my boyfriend, then fiance, now husband. We love to travel, so we would go on these long road trips and things like that. And so for me, it was always sort of like, let's work enough, make enough money to go do this thing we want to do. And that was always sort of how I set up my my work life in general, was sort of like, what do I want? What is my end goal? How much do I have to do to get to the thing I actually want to be doing? Um, so yeah, there was a lot of sort of odd jobs in there before cosmetology school, and then yeah, salon
Oh,
jobs.
great. So great. Yeah. Just being able to have that personal agency to craft your own life, to know that you can set a goal and achieve it, and that that may change. You might want to do something else. Now you're a new staff member at Sudbury Valley. And you'll be able to do that for as long as you want. And then maybe there'll be something else. And just this feeling of being able to iterate throughout your life and, set goals and accomplish them, must be a really powerful feeling. I'm curious what some of your classmates' experiences were, Francesca. What did they go on to do after they graduated?
Let's see. It's funny because I didn't graduate with like my main group of friends. There were friends ahead of me and there were friends behind me, but the year that I graduated, it was there was a couple other, we call ourselves lifers, people who have been here their whole lives. So there was a couple other lifers in there that I had literally grown up with. So it wasn't like I didn't know the people very well, but of them, of just the year that I graduated, only one of them is somebody I keep in touch with. And actually, his son and my son are a year apart, and so I spent a lot of time with his partner, and we do a lot of things together because I first of all adore her, and it's very fun. But he's working for the town of Wellesley, I think. He's on their DPW. But then, so of my friends, there were one of them went to art school, and they are a graphic artist and do really just cool pieces of both digital art, and then as well, like, it's not plastic, but it's like a hard substance pieces. Then there's my brother went here. He's in school right now to become a physical therapist. So he's almost done with his schooling, and he did that later on. Like he did a lot of things first, and sort of it took him tearing his Achilles tendon to figure out that he wanted to be a physical therapist. My husband owns his own business. He does landscape design and architecture, and is also a physical artist. He does a lot of like stone and wood and sculpture. My sister-in-law went to Sudbury Valley. She's a veterinarian. Of the rest of us, there's sort of, I'm trying to think of like who I actually kind of kept in touch with. A lot of people, it's really funny. We tend to follow passions versus careers almost, where you really, one of my good friends, she's an incredible painter, and through the years it's sort of always been a hobby which she has pursued more and more to make a profession. And now she's consulting and having a mobile art studio, and going all these incredible places and these incredible paintings. And it's really, yeah, we're kind of all over the map. There's a lot of us. One of the kids I went to school with, he is he was really into fashion when we were in school together, and actually created like a fashion corp here at Sudbury Valley, and they had a fashion show, and now he designs shoes and is like really successful in his field. Yeah, we're kind of all over the place.
Oh, great. Yeah. I love your point about we pursue passions more than careers, but then of course create careers out of those passions, which it sounds like is more the rule than the exception. And, independent academic research that's been done on Sudbury Valley School, as well as self-directed education more generally, unschoolers and so forth, find that children who learn in these kinds of environments often tend to become entrepreneurs related to passions that they developed in childhood and adolescence because they had the freedom and autonomy to do that. Also a high number of people in the creative arts, and that's sort of reflected in the stories that you're talking about too. So just so great to see that. So was it ever a question for you that you would be sending your children to Sudbury Valley?
Never. No, I never questioned that. In fact, it's actually interesting when my husband and I had talked about where we wanted to settle, what we wanted to do. I was sort of like, look, we can go anywhere we want to go. Once our kids are 4 years old, we're living in Massachusetts and we're going to Sudbury Valley. That's what we're doing. And I was always, I think of myself as being very flexible. I don't necessarily have that reputation, but I think that I am. So one of the things I was probably the most rigid about was saying this is where I want to be. This is where I want them to grow up. This is what I want for them. And obviously now, which we didn't have when I was younger, there are a lot more Sudbury schools. There are a lot more Sudbury schools now than there were when I, obviously first came in 1992 was when I enrolled. Now there are definitely more options, but I knew personally that I wanted my kids here. I wanted this building, this campus, this experience for them. And it is very different now than it was when I was here. There's a lot of changes that have happened. Just naturally, obviously, over the course of a lifetime, things change. But even knowing that it was not going to be exactly the same as it was for me, I wanted it for them. So.
Yeah. And so what has it been like? Your oldest is 7, so has been there for several years. What is that like now for her and your experience kind of seeing Sudbury Valley through her eyes as a parent? What has that been like?
Oh, it's one of the things I would say that's really the most different is that technology. We didn't
Mm.
have phones. We didn't have laptops. We didn't have all that stuff. Like we eventually had phones, but not like we have phones now. Like that was not a thing. The internet room here at Sudbury Valley was a big deal. Like when we got the internet room, because you could go online during the day, which is like a concept that I sometimes try to explain to my 7-year-old. She's like, "What? Didn't you just like on your phone?" I'm like, "No, no, no, no. You
In
don't
the
understand.
dial-up,
We didn't have
the
to
sound
literally like
of
you
the
have like
modem.
I was trying to explain to somebody the other day how you couldn't use the telephone, like your
Right.
landline telephone at the same time, and they were like, "Why?" And this was like a 19-year-old, and I was like, "I don't know why. We just couldn't. It just was what it was." Um, so it's very different. The technology I would say is the biggest difference, but it's really funny because on the one hand it's such a huge difference, and on the other hand, you still see so many aspects that are the same, even with this great difference, this great change where, it used to be that you would have somebody that's maybe they would be reading a book or maybe they would be drawing a picture, maybe they would be doing something, but now they're on a game, but they're on a game together. They're all crowded around this one little phone. You have like 5 little heads over the little tablet trying to do the thing, or I love it. I love listening to the young kids in the internet room now with some of the older kids in the internet room, and they'll be like, "Hey, how do I do blah 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 blah?" And you have somebody like yelling out an answer, or like whatever the thing is, and it's sort of like that. The ease of communication still exists. The age mingling still exists. The community aspect still exists. It just looks a little different. It's very funny because I think for me as a parent, my daughter was born in 2016, so we were definitely. It was the whole screen thing was new for me, that I had never considered what screen time was like, or too much screen time, or you know internet restrictions for little ones, or content restrictions for little ones. That was just I was so kind of flooded and overwhelmed with that aspect of parenting. I think that was one of the harder ones for me, of being like, wait, how do I give my child freedom and personal autonomy, and at the same time protect them from something that could really be detrimental or dangerous to them, in this
Mm.
regard. And the whole thing is that you have to communicate with your kids.
Mm.
You talk to them, you tell them, to the best of your ability what you're thinking and feeling, and give them the opportunity to then tell you what they're thinking and feeling. And then try to communicate and work towards a goal that is beneficial for all the parties involved. And obviously, as a parent, there are going to be times where you say, like, no, you can't do this, or yeah, you have to wear your jacket, or this is where we're going now, and you don't really have a choice. But for me, it was like there were so many aspects of parenting where I could give them a choice, that it was more complicated for me to give them a choice. It was harder. There's a lot more conversation. There's a lot more debate about everything you do when you're giving them a choice, but
because they demand that freedom, right? They're accustomed to it. Yeah.
Right from the
Yeah.
get-go, they want that. And if we encourage it from them right from the get-go, they pop into a place like Sudbury Valley, like, well, duh. Yeah, this is just what you do. This is how you do it. This is, what this is supposed to look like. They don't know anything different.
I'm curious, Francesca, as someone who kind of attended Sudbury Valley before the internet, became ubiquitous, and then like right as it was becoming, much more a part of our lives, and then seeing your children, especially your older daughter, who's just kind of grown up with this, it seems to me that kind of being able to drive our own education, have access to information and knowledge is so much easier now because it's literally at our fingertips. We have so many resources and tools, many of which are free, available to us, that it almost seems like, why wouldn't more people choose self-directed education? Because we do have just so much opportunity to learn anything we want from anyone, anywhere, at any time. Do you feel that?
I do. I think that honestly, self-directed education is, I think, harder for parents. I think it's absolutely right on for kids, and it's hugely, to trust your child, just to trust them right from just to know, to trust them is difficult. And then to the self-motivation factor, to watch them pursue things that you may not agree with, that you're sort of saying like, oh, I would really rather you do this other thing instead, but I'm going to back off and I'm going to let you pursue this thing and understand. I mean, it's so funny because I remember being a student and like never questioned, oh, I'm going to go do this thing. Oh, I'm going to do this thing. Oh, I'm so into this thing. And I'm, moving forward. And my parents really didn't push me in any direction. My parents were really, really have just always been so supportive of me as an individual. And now I watch my daughter sort of doing these things and I'm like, ooh, you don't want to maybe ride your bike instead of doing that? Okay, all right. But I know how that process looks from the other side. That natural, I'm going to do this for a little while, then I'm going to do this for a little while, then I'm going to do this for a little while. And I know that like I just sort of have to button my lip basically and take a back seat and let her continue to steer where she wants to go.
Right. And that intensity or commitment to something that a child is passionate about it at a certain time can and will carry over to other pursuits in life, sort of adult or like you said, kind of passions in adulthood, because you're used to sort of committing to something and going all in and learning as much as you can and really committing to perfecting whatever it is that you're doing at the time. So
and failing, I think, is the other thing about that, is to do it and to say like, ooh, that didn't feel good. Oh, I don't like that. Okay. And to not have failure be this sort of this monster that you're frightened of, and really have it just be a part of the learning process where, oh, the first time you baked a cake, you used baking soda instead of baking powder. Literally, the first time I baked a cake, I used baking soda instead of baking powder. And it was gross. It was like fizzy. It was terrible. It was like not, my parents were like, ooh, good try. Like, no, this is wrong. And instead of being like, oh, I'm never going to bake again, or like, I really feel terrible about this, it's like, oh, okay, this thing. And then it's like, well, just that sort of natural, the failure that is built into the pursuit of new things, because there's always going to be some level of failure. And I think that when you give your kids the freedom, the lead to sort of do whatever it is they're passionate about, failure becomes a natural part of the process versus a thing to be frightened of.
Oh, great. So you've had all these wonderful perspectives of Sudbury Valley School, first as a student, then as an alum, then as a parent, and now as a part-time staff member. What has that been like for you to have that new viewpoint?
It's been a lot like what I imagine it's like if you go away for a long time, like from your home, and then you come back and you're like, why are the spoons in the wrong place? Like, why did you put the glasses upside down instead of, like, that's not how we put that away. So there's a lot of me having to be like, okay, like, relax. It's different now. It's okay. And then there's a lot of sort of like homecoming for me.
Mm.
I didn't know how it was going to go. They asked me to come for an interim staffing position because they were fairly shorthanded, and because of the fact that I grew up here and was involved so thoroughly in committees and corporations and sort of the running of everything, there was no like training process necessary for
Mm.
me. There was no, I didn't have to like absorb into the philosophy of the place. It's in my DNA basically. It was just sort of, which I think would be true for any lifer in the same position. Like I think that any of us could come back sort of and step into a staffing role in a very organic way because of the fact that it's not, we don't have to be taught about the
Right.
philosophy. We are the philosophy. You know, we grew up in the philosophy. This is who we are. So at first I was sort of like, I don't know how this is going to go. You know, I'll give it a shot. I'll help out where I can. And then within a couple of weeks of being back, I was sort of like, it's as it's as special a place to me now personally as it was when I was here personally. And it's always been special to me, and it was special to me in a different way when I was just a parent. But now that I'm in a different role, it's I don't know, it's sort of like just homecoming, I guess.
So neat. And great to sort of see, what the next half century of Sudbury Valley will look like. What do you think? What is your sort of prediction around alternative education? You mentioned that now there are so many more options, which is wonderful. More families have choices beyond kind of a local district school, more of these sort of child-centered options than ever before. What is your sense of, as the pioneer, Sudbury Valley School, one of the original sort of alternative schools, and certainly, the model kind of democratic, self-directed school? What do you think the next 50 years holds?
I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that question as much as, I think what we saw happen in 2020 with the pandemic and what it looked like to do distance learning, I think a lot of people had to trust their children. They had to trust them to be doing their schooling on their own to a certain extent. And I think some parents got to see what it might look like to trust their children in a different pursuit, in a pursuit that actually made sense to their child versus what made sense to the state. Or I think that it's so interesting to me how our lives have changed, how society has changed in the last 50 years, but schooling hasn't changed. The way
Mm.
that we teach kids hasn't changed. And it's sort of like, how can you look at the influx of technology, the difference in our time demands that we have now that we did years and years ago, the difference in the ability to gain knowledge, like you were saying, so quickly. Like, you have these little computers in your hand all the time. I think that what I hope that parents are going to see is how there is not a one size fits all in anything that we do. There is no one solution for any given problem. And I think that what I hope to see is more and more different types of education popping up. Sudbury schools and homeschool resource centers and self-directed education, and all of those things where you get to sort of see what benefits your child. You get to look at your individual child and say, you want to pursue this thing? Here's the right environment for you. And not just expect that we are all going to find the rightness in one situation. I think the thing is for a lot of people, what public school teaches you is how to deal with being unhappy from the time you are very young. And I think that is so wrong to do to our young people. We should not be teaching them that it's right to be unhappy. We should be teaching them how to find their happiness, how to create their happiness, how to change their circumstances, their environments in order to suit their needs, and not to change themselves to fit somebody else's idea of what it should look like.
Yeah, I think that is such a profound point, Francesca, that we've sort of become complacent with this idea that, oh, kids don't like school. No wonder you dread Monday
"Well, I didn't like
mornings.
it, and you can go, and
Yeah. Or of
what's gonna happen
course,
when you have to go to work?"
exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. And then we sort of accept that, oh, well, I don't like Monday mornings as a worker. So why should you like Monday mornings as a learner? And neither of those is acceptable. Like, we should be able to have that kind of personal agency to find happiness and fulfillment in our lives. And certainly for students who are accustomed to that through learning at Sudbury Valley School and similar models, it would be unacceptable to be unhappy that, these learners know that they really are in charge of their own lives and their own livelihoods, and they can change course at any time to make sure that they are pursuing the goals and passions that matter most to them. So I love your point about embracing all of these alternatives and hopefully lots of choices for families in the years to come. What's the plug, though, as we kind of wrap up for Sudbury Valley specifically? What would you want prospective parents to know about what makes Sudbury Valley so special and why they should consider sending their kids there? And some parents, move. What I'm so blown away by with Sudbury Valley is parents move from across the country. They move
Other
across
countries.
oceans.
Yep.
So, my little 45-minute drive to Sudbury Valley doesn't seem such a hard lift
Big picture,
compared to
right?
what others do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is that plug to really consider Sudbury Valley?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think the thing for me is that we've been doing this since 1968. We have thousands of graduates throughout the world who are the kind of people I want my kids to be. If I could give them anything, I would give them a sense of self and happiness. And I think that's something that our alumni share, is the ease of being with yourself and of creating your own happiness and of your pursuit. And I think that for Sudbury Valley, we're tried and true. We've done it for years, and we will continue to do it, hopefully, for many years to come. And we had a 50th event for alumni, and we got to come together with people from just every year that Sudbury Valley had been around, and it was an incredible experience to see how different our alumni are and how similar they are.
I love that. Well, the website is sudburyvalley.org. And Francesca, it has been such a joy talking with you today. Thank you so much for being
Well, thank you for
on
having me.
the Liberated podcast.
Thank you, Carrie.